It is so good to see everyone here. We're especially thankful for our visitors. We appreciate y'all being here. Some of you just don't count as visitors. You're home folk. You just don't get to come out here very often. But when you do, you're home folk, and we appreciate you being here. It's good to see Betty back up and around a little bit. It's kind of tough, I understand. Connie and there's several others here. And of course, you know, Mahaffey's sitting over here with this neck brace, but I ain't shortening my sermon just because he's got a neck brace, okay? We're not letting that slide this morning. We just want to say, but it's good to see he and Kathy doing well. When you look at the text, I'm going to try to introduce this in a way that will not be unpalatable, but we have a propensity, we human beings, and I'm not sure I have some suggestions as to why we do this, but we like our heroes. We tend to elevate sometimes individuals and put them on a little bit of podium or a platform just a tad bit higher, and I'm not sure why that is the case, because we do like our heroes. I just won't tolerate anybody saying anything bad about John Wayne, but I know he was just a guy, and he probably made mistakes, but you know, he's kind of my hero. But I have discovered, though, according to 1 Corinthians 10:12, that to him who thinks he stands, he should take heed lest he fall. Now, I've always translated that into this equation. When you fall, depending upon how high you get elevated, is how much the fall's going to hurt. And so I've always taken the idea, people think, oh, you're just being humble. No, I don't want to get hurt when I fall. That's really what it is. It's fear of being damaged. But I don't want to be elevated. I don't think any man really wants to be elevated, but we tend to do that. We love our heroes. And I can't imagine a better time for an introduction like this to a lesson like we're going to look at than right after the elections. And some of the responses that have been all over the internet, if you watch that, all over the TV, if you're watching that, there's some folks that are just giddy with excitement, and there's other folks that are just off the deep edge. I mean, just can't deal with it. And part of the reason is they elevate this guy we've got in as a president now, and I just want to be very cautious and warn just very kindly that he's, I hope, going to be a better president than our last one. I mean, we hope that for any president that gets inaugurated into office. We hope they'll be better than the last one, but let's not place people on a big stand up here that gives them an opportunity to fall really far. I mean, we've got examples of that. I don't want to go too far into politics, but I can imagine there's so many politicians we've had such great aspirations for and great respect and admiration for, and then all of a sudden something is done or it comes out of the woodwork. The closet gets thrown wide open and 6 skeletons fall out, and we go, oh no. And all of a sudden we have a different attitude about that individual. Growing up as a preacher's kid and a preacher's grandkid, I was witness to so many sorrowful instances where preachers of great renown who just awed me in my younger years and even through my 20s and 30s. And then I watched them do something so incredibly foolish that just totally ruined them. They left the church, they left the truth, and I'm looking at the talent and the skill and the potential, and I'm going, oh, how the mighty have fallen. And so one of the ways that we can keep the mighty from falling is being very cautious when we, as individuals, place people above where they really ought to be. We ought not to think more highly of ourselves than we ought. That's just something we ought to keep in mind. However, when God says somebody's great, then we need to listen. I want you to turn back to Deuteronomy, if you would, for a moment. In Deuteronomy, the swan song of the great man Moses, I want to read a text back there that is inspired by God. And I want us to give thought just briefly to it, because this is stated by the inspiration of God about Moses. Look at chapter 34 in Deuteronomy, right at the very end of the book. This is kind of like a eulogy. And in verse 10, I'm going to start reading there. And I want you to read what God's attitude about Moses was. And then it'll bring to mind the idea that, the Jews really elevated Moses. As a matter of fact, God's law
in his covenant with the Israelite people. You know, it's often called Moses' law. You know, you want to talk about getting elevated. There's a guy that's been put way up there because he's right under God, because he's the one that gave it, but he got to get the name for it sometimes. And the Bible uses that term. But notice what it reads. But since then there has not arisen in Israel a prophet like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. And all the signs and wonders which the Lord sent him to do in the land of Egypt, before Pharaoh, before all his servants, in all his land, and by all that mighty power and all that great terror which Moses performed in the sight of all Israel. You want to talk about a eulogy? Now there's one that's saying this guy's great. But here's the difference. God is saying it. You see, when God says somebody's great, he is indeed great. You and I, we sometimes tend to put people on a pedestal. As a matter of fact, the unfortunate side of that is we very often sometimes put people in a position where our love for them is greater than our love for God, and it's because of the way we feel about them. We need to run back to Matthew 10:34 and following, where Jesus made the comment that sometimes the worst enemies you will have are those of your own household. Those whose relationship is the closest to you and those whom you think the most of. It's a very difficult thing. It's a hard thing to be a Christian. If it weren't, there would, the whole world be Christian. But it's not easy. As Jesus describes our life, he said those that choose this kind of life are choosing a narrow way. It's difficult. We always talk about the straight and narrow, and people think it's straight. Not like a dog's hind leg, but that's not what that straight means. It means pinched. And you know what it's like to get pinched. You know, somebody pinches you. Most of us don't like that because it hurts and it squeezes. And that's what it is. When you become a Christian, it's pinched. It's hard to go down. And that's why people don't choose it. They don't choose it because it's a little difficult. But when we look at people who God says are great, we need to give ear, we need to give attention, we need to try to figure out what is it about these folks that God says is so great. Because when you look at the list that we have in Hebrews 11, that great hall of faith, you can go through all of these other ones, which we won't bother to do because Happy's got a neck brace, so we got to get on with this. So therefore, we're not going to go through them all, but we are going to go through a couple here real quickly and just look at these guys and make some, I think, some positive observations about who God thinks is great. Because in the first place, God doesn't think you're great because you're somebody. As a matter of fact, in Deuteronomy, it wasn't long before the children of Israel were already copping an attitude as they went into the Canaan land, and God told them flat out, I didn't choose you because y'all special, y'all better than anybody else. You're the smallest bunch, you're rebellious, and he even predicted the fact you're going to rebel against me as we go along the way. But he says, I picked you so that I can use you as an example to what we ought to be and who would follow God. And he tested them. So you look in the illustration here, most all of these come from patriarchs and the Mosaic period. As a matter of fact, all of them do. And that's why I believe they're set there for our example so that we can look at these and wonder, okay, why were they great? Well, I want you to notice some of the things that we can understand. They weren't great because of who they were. As a matter of fact, when you look through these, let's remind ourselves in verse 32 of these characters and see a little bit, just briefly notice. I'm not even going to reference them. You can look them up. But you know, Gideon, let's see, where was Gideon found when he was first called? Why, he was threshing wheat in the bottom of a wine press trying to hide because the children of Israel were being persecuted. Okay? Did God just pick a coward? Well, no, that's not exactly it. It was a little self-preservation going on there with Gideon. But he wasn't out there in front of his enemies just saying, taunting them, saying, come on, come get it, because God's with me. As a matter of fact, when he was called, his response was, if I'm the guy that's supposed to leave and we're all that great of people, how come we're in the situation we're in and I'm down here in this wine press threshing wheat if we're all that good? Okay, so we're looking at a guy here who didn't show great signs of leadership skill. Look at the next one, Barak. I always like Barak. Barak, he was the one that they decided we're going to go to war against our enemies. But you know what? The prophetess Deborah is the one that told us by God through Deborah that we need to go to war. And you know, I have great confidence in God, but if I ain't going to war without Deborah, I'm not going out there and fighting without Deborah. And Deborah warned him, if you do this and don't do what God told you to do going out there, women's going to get the credit for this war. And sure enough, Sisera was killed by a woman, the great general of the opposing army, was killed by a woman. And it was the song of Deborah and Barak, you know. It was like, that doesn't sound like a manly man to me. But yet Barak is listed. Samson. Oh, we don't have the time. You know, Samson, he was a great guy. Was he really? He was separated from his birth for God's purpose and to do what God wanted him to do. And he was a petulant, spoiled brat. That's a nice way to put it. And spent most of his life not doing what he was told to do. And yet God, at the very end of his life, gave him the power to take care of the job he was supposed to take care of his entire life. But when you look at his whole life, well, we're not looking at perfection there. Jephthah was a fall behind. He was the son of a harlot. He came in and run the show, and then he made this foolish vow and said, anything after this war, since God gave me the victory in this war, anything comes from my house, I'm going to sacrifice it. Here comes his only child, his daughter. Wasn't very wise. And we don't have time to get into David. I mean, it was mentioned this morning in class. Look at David. Look at the things he did. And he was a man after God's own heart. I'm about to tell you why that is the case. And Samuel, you know, most of the time we think of Samuel, he started young, serving Eli. There's just not a whole lot we see about Samuel that wasn't real good, except the little fit he threw when the children of Israel said, we want a king like everybody else. And Samuel puffed out his lower lip and said, they don't like me. You know, I've told this to preachers sometimes, just kind of in their face. You get up and preach the gospel, guess what? You're going to get unpopular with some people. You know, I tell this to Christians. If you're going to be a Christian and you're going to be serious about helping your neighbors go to heaven, you're going to be unpopular sometimes. And we just have to remember that, you know what? God told Samuel, they're not rejecting you. Buck up, boy, quit throwing a fit here. They're not rejecting you, they're rejecting me as king. That's what the problem is. We need to remember that. But I want you to notice all these. And the prophets, we can go on and on about all the prophets and the many things that they went through, as well as the rest of the chapter previous to these mentioned names. So what's the point? Well, the point is, do you see any of them in there that's perfect? Do you see any of them in there that made no mistakes? Do you see any of them in there that deserve in our mind to be put on a pedestal and set way up here? Well, God did, and He listed them by inspiration. Now, why is that? Well, going back and looking at all these things, Gideon decided, okay, God, I'm going to trust you on this one. And I, of course, he tested God a couple of times with some fleas. He said, I'll trust you on this one. And with nothing more than candles, you know, he went out and circled all the Amalekites, thousands of fellows, sand of the sea is the way it's described. And he circled them and broke the lamps, and they started killing each other, and God gave him a massive victory. You look at Barak, yeah, he was a little bit of a weenie when it came to getting out and doing jobs. But when Deborah went with him, he went out there, they conquered. They had a victory song about it. You look at Samson. We talked about him. Oh, his whole life was a mess, a wreck. But, you know, at the end, he got his mind back where it ought to be, and he did what God intended for him to do, afflict the Philistines, and boy, did he on his last try. You look at Jephthah. He kept his vow. Yeah, it was a foolish vow. And what he could say, oh, God, move up back. I didn't mean it. Mulligan, if you're a golfer, you know what that is. Mulligan, you know, I need a do-over. No, he kept his vow. David, I have sinned against God, he would say concerning the Bathsheba and Uriah incident. And of course the consequences plagued him, all the rest of it, but he stayed with God. You'll notice Samuel, the same kind of thing. He picked himself up and said, okay, fine. In fact, he made the statement, God forbid that I don't tell you guys the right things to do. Even though you've rejected me and you've rejected God, I'm still going to teach and preach to you. What made these people great? It wasn't their perfection. As a matter of fact, I think sometimes our heroes we put on a pedestal because we're ignorant. I'm going to try to say that as nice as I can, but we're ignorant. We just don't know all the details about humans, And therefore we put them on this pedestal, and it's like a revelation when we find out, well, they're not perfect. Wow, they made that mistake? And all of a sudden they go down in our estimation. Why? Maybe we weren't realistic when we put them on the pedestal we put them on to fall off of and get hurt. Folks, when you look at all these people, God would say in verse 38, it's a profound statement in my view, is my opinion, but I'm telling you, when he says, after listing all of the things they went through, the sacrifices they were willing to make because they believed in God, they had faith in God, it says, of whom the world was not worthy. Now that's you and me, brothers and sisters in Christ. That's us. Because we have a home that we look for. We seek those things above, not things on this earth. We're looking to a home beyond, like Abraham was, which is mentioned before in this very chapter. And this world is not my home. We sing a song like that. This world is not my home. I'm just a passing through. We are temporary here, sojourners in the land that really doesn't belong to us, and we don't want any part of it. We want something that's so much better, described in Revelation 20 in such beautiful, figurative language. But streets of gold. The old boy had joke about the old boy that died, wanted to take gold with him. Gets up to St. Peter's Gate, as the old saying goes, and Peter goes, "What you got in your pocket?" He said, "Well, I brought my gold with me." He says, "What are you bringing paving for?" You know, we're going to a place where it's figuratively talked about streets paved with gold. There is so much great and beautiful and wonderful in that place. There is nothing on earth I want or will keep me from going to heaven. There's nothing here I love more than the idea of going to heaven. Now, what's interesting, and this is where we have these examples for our learning, Romans 15:4, is in verse 39. All these he's mentioned in this great hall of faith, brethren. They obtained a good testimony, and they obtained it through faith. It wasn't because they were perfect. It wasn't because they were elevated because they were somebody and thought themselves to be such. No. They understood that faith coming by hearing. When you hear God and you hear Him talk to you through His Word, you need to do what it says. And when you do, you live by faith, not by sight. And when you do that, then you have a hope of heaven. But you notice what he says here about them, all these having obtained a good testimony through faith, did not receive the promise. They all lived in anticipation of something that they never saw. You know, they never saw Jesus Christ. And by the way, in the context here, and I'm going to keep this in the context, Hebrews 11, Hebrews the book. What is Hebrews about? Why the examples in chapter 11 of all these people? The whole book of Hebrews is about Jesus is better than everything else. In fact, my point being, Jesus is the only one we should put on a pedestal. He will never fall. He never did while he was here. He never will. He's the only one really that deserves to be on a pedestal, other than who God says, look at these people and follow them and understand they're human, they make mistakes. But my punchline in the end of my lesson, because I'm going to do this real quick, because he's got a neck brace on, I don't know how he did it. I'm trying to work this around. But you know, the lesson that's taught is in the two verses next. I already overburdened Ray with this long scripture reading, and it had hard names. He did great, by the way. But I didn't want to overburden him with the punchline, and that's in the next chapter, verses 1 and 2. Because, you know, we always tend, and I don't know why we do that. Maybe we do it because it's easier to put somebody else on a pedestal than not so much as expected of me, you see. But you know what? When you look back at all of these people, they're just regular, everyday Joes. Every one of them. That's like you and me. And I know how it is. Sometimes we like to put somebody on a pedestal because then not so much is expected of me now. Because we've got this person over here. I really believe in religious concepts and religious orders. That is why you have pastors and reverends and all of these different guys that are titled and wear their collar backwards and stand above you theologically because they're better than you. I believe that's why it is. Because when you have a guy like that, you can just say, well, he said thus and so, and that's what I'm going to bank on. And I don't have to study the Bible that way. I don't have to understand what God said. My faith is based on what Joe Snuffy said because he is somebody and we've got him on a pedestal. And I do believe religious people are very comfortable with that. Don't you dare think you can go to heaven and stand at the judgment before you get there and say, well, Jeff said. Okay? It ain't going to work. Jeff's nobody. Jeff has no authority. Jesus Christ is the one on the pedestal. I love this pulpit scenario. It's on the floor. It's not raised up as though, in a smaller room like this, you need to have a guy elevated when he speaks to you. I don't need to be elevated. Nobody that speaks needs to be elevated. God did not elevate me. I have no right. But I do want to tell you where he has elevated us, and he speaks to you and I, okay? Because after he lists all these names and all these common Joes that did wonderful things, therefore, the conclusion drawn in 12:1 is based on chapter 11. You see that? This is context. It's based on all of these guys and people and women and ladies and stuff that was talked about in that previous chapter who were just regular people, but they did great things because of their faith. Therefore, we also, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which so easily ensnares us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is set down at the right hand of the throne of God. You know what, brethren? We are great. We are a character as Christians this world is not worthy of. This world is full of death and corruption and sin and ugliness. And we need to view ourselves appropriately in God's eyes. It is a blessing for us to be in our communities and impact people and show them a way to go to heaven. We're not out here to just pat them over the head with the Bible and tell them, you're sinning, you're going to hell. That's not our job. That's not what we do. No, to the contrary, we say, we, by faith, are going to heaven, and we want you to go with us to heaven. Now, I realize there's sacrifice. Look at the text that we just read here. Of all the things they sacrifice, there's sacrifice. And it's not an easy decision, because there's stuff you got to give up. There's stuff you can't do anymore. You got to quit that. But there's so much we can do, and so much joy to be had, not just in this life. Jesus came to give us an abundant life now, but especially what's beyond. And if you got your mind right, that's where you're looking, beyond. You're not looking at right here. In fact, every one of those mentioned in this chapter 11, they were looking for something beyond. By faith, they were looking beyond to a beautiful, bright, wonderful place where our bodies don't get infirmed, where we miss the assembly like my brother Ira because he's just struggling to get up and get going, where we have to go through procedures like Mahaffey has because of the pain that this body deals us. We're looking to a place that is so much better. And you know what? God expects that of us, and he has elevated us to that. Not us. We're not somebody. But because we look to the Christ, who is the head of the church, the only one, who belongs on that pedestal, who will never fall from it. Even though we, like David and Jephthah and all of the others mentioned here, may fall on occasion, we need to pick ourselves back up, because faith has accommodation for repentance and coming back to God. And that segues into an invitation. If you want to be on that big list in that big book that's going to be opened at the judgment day, and your name found there among the greats, like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, like Moses and Job and Daniel and Noah, if your name's going to be there on that list with all those greats, then you need to walk by faith and recognize that our purpose, our being, is about Christ, and the only one on a pedestal is Jesus. He's the one that has all authority. If we follow him and we do what he says and be a Christian, Christ-like, then we'll have a hope of eternal life. You know, the examples given to us, we just elevate them so high, and I think we do so because that excuses us. There's no excuse for us not being what we ought to be. I was going to say be all you can be, but I think that's a military thing that kind of made me nauseous when I was in the Navy. But nevertheless, that's kind of what we're getting at. You can reach your full potential only if you're a Christian and looking beyond. I'd invite you to do that this morning as we stand and we sing.